Wyoming Territory, August 1884. The wind carried dust across the open plains as thunderheads gathered to the west. But it was not the storm that had the town of Red Bluff uneasy. It was the girl found wandering the road outside town with 2 children clinging to her skirts. Pearl Ashford stood barefoot in front of Langley's general store, her dress torn near the hem, her hair dark with sweat and road dust. She held a boy on her hip, maybe 4 years old, and a younger girl clung to her leg, both children silent, their eyes wide and tired. "Where's their father?" someone asked. "Gone," Pearl answered. Her voice was low but steady. "Both of them were left behind when their mother died. I could not leave them. I will not." She had ridden from Cheyenne with nothing but a single satchel and a promise she had made to a dying woman in a boarding house: take care of the children, get them somewhere safe. And she had kept riding until the horse collapsed 10 miles outside Red Bluff. Now she stood, waiting, knowing she had nowhere else to go. From across the street, a man had been watching, tall, square-shouldered, with a sun-darkened face and quiet eyes. His name was Thorne Sutton, and he had not spoken to Pearl since they were children in Missouri, when she used to chase fireflies with him on summer nights. He had not seen her since she left the county at 16, and he had not known she was back until this very moment. He stepped off the porch of the sheriff's office and crossed the street like he meant to get answers. "Pearl," he said, stopping a few feet away. She turned fast, startled. Her face changed when she saw him. "Thorne." He nodded once. "It is really you." Pearl stared at him a long moment, trying to match the man in front of her to the boy she used to know, the one who had taught her to climb trees and kissed her once behind the barn before the war came and tore everything down. "You live here?" she asked. "I ranch a few miles out. Came into town to help with cattle records." Pearl shifted the boy on her hip. "I did not expect to see anyone from Clay County out here." "You look tired," Thorne said after a pause. "Looks like the kids are too." "They are not mine," she added quickly. "Their mother worked at the boarding house in Cheyenne. She got sick. No one else would take them." Thorne's eyes moved between the little boy and girl. "What are their names?" The girl peeked out from behind Pearl's skirt. "I am Winnie," she whispered. The boy did not speak, just leaned his head against Pearl's shoulder. "Wesley," Pearl said softly. "He has not said a word since she died." Thorne nodded. "Come with me. You all need a place to rest." Pearl hesitated. "I do not want charity. I am not offering charity. Just a roof and some quiet for now." She studied his face. It had changed, leaner, older, marked by years and whatever he had survived since the war, but the steadiness in his eyes was the same. "All right," she said. They rode in Thorne's wagon, Pearl holding the children close, while the wind picked up behind them and the first drops of rain hit the dirt road. Thorne's land stretched wide and quiet, framed by hills and the big Wyoming sky. His ranch house sat low near a bend in the creek, whitewashed and plain but sturdy. Inside, it smelled of wood smoke and leather. Thorne built a fire and brought out blankets. Pearl settled the children on the floor by the hearth, brushing dust from their faces. "I will fix you something to eat," Thorne said, already moving toward the kitchen. Pearl watched him a moment, then looked back at the children. "You are safe now," she whispered to them. "I promise." After supper, when the children were asleep on a bed made from quilts folded on the floor, Pearl stepped out onto the porch. Thorne was there, sitting on the top step, looking out over his land. She sat beside him. The air smelled of wet grass and horses. "I did not think I would ever see you again," she said quietly. "I thought you had gone east. Almost did. But everything kept falling apart. I ended up in Cheyenne working in a boarding house. That is where I met their mother." Thorne looked at her. "You could have left them behind." "I know. But you did not." Pearl's hands were clasped tight in her lap. "She asked me to take them. She was scared. I could not say no." He nodded once, like that answer made sense. "You always had more heart than most." Pearl let out a breath. "You seem different." I suppose I am. War, losing family, building things from nothing. That changes a man. She turned her head toward him. You were always kind. I am not sure I am anymore. She reached over and touched his hand just briefly. You are. The touch was light, but it landed like something important. He looked at her, not moving away, just watching her steady face in the dim porch light. I do not know what I am going to do, she admitted. I have no money. No work. Just them. You can stay here until you figure it out, Thorne said. There is space. And I could use the help. She looked over at him. You want me to work for you? I want you to have a place to breathe, he said. And I would not mind the company. Pearl smiled then, the first smile he had seen from her in years. It was tired, but it was real. All right, she said. They sat quiet for a while, the night stretching out around them. Inside, the children slept. Outside, the stars came out one by one, and Pearl leaned back against the porch rail, her shoulder brushing Thorne's. Neither of them spoke again, but something between them had shifted. The old thread that had tied them together when they were young had not frayed, it had just gone quiet for a long time. And now it was pulling again. By the end of the first week, Pearl found a rhythm in the quiet hours of the Sutton ranch. She rose before daylight, tied back her hair without looking in the mirror, and fed the children while Thorne checked the pasture fencing. The cabin had 2 rooms. Thorne gave her the smaller one, took the floor by the fire himself, and made no talk of when she should leave. Winnie followed Pearl constantly, asking questions in a whisper while Wesley trailed behind with silent, watchful steps. Pearl taught Winnie how to wash linens with lye soap and showed her how to press dough into a tin with her small fingers. Wesley watched but never touched, keeping his hands tucked into his sides like he feared they might betray him. One afternoon, Pearl stood with her sleeves rolled to the elbow, hanging damp clothes on the line that stretched between the porch and a post sunk deep in the earth. A steady wind moved through the tall grass, bending it like waves on water. She felt someone watching her and turned to find Thorne leaning against the porch post, arms crossed. You always that fast with chores? He asked. I had to be, she said without turning from the wash. A house full of boarders does not wait for a girl to catch her breath. I mean it. You're quicker than most ranch hands I've known. Need me to break horses next? Her voice was dry, not quite teasing. I wouldn't put it past you, he said, stepping down from the porch. But I was thinking about the garden. I've been meaning to turn the far corner of the yard. There's good soil there. She pushed a clothespin into place. I've grown things before. Then maybe you'd help me plant. Beans to start. Maybe squash come spring. She nodded, brushing a damp strand of hair from her cheek. You've got a shovel? In the shed. I'll fetch it. When he returned, they worked side by side, turning hard soil until the sun dipped close to the hills. Pearl's hands blistered before she let herself stop, leaning on the shovel a moment. Thorne looked over. You'll tear your palms if you don't wear gloves. There weren't any to spare where I came from. I'll find you a pair. She didn't answer, but she didn't refuse him either. That night, he left a set of worn leather gloves on the windowsill in the kitchen. Pearl saw them but said nothing. The next morning, Wesley crawled into her bed before dawn and curled against her side. He didn't speak. She lay still, one hand on his small back, and let him stay. Later, Thorne came in from the barn, brushing hay from his coat. Winnie says Wesley followed her outside last night. Pearl looked up from the skillet. He hasn't set foot past the porch since we arrived. Winnie said he went to the barn. Just stood there. Didn't call for anyone. Pearl turned the cornbread with the flat of the knife. Maybe he's looking for something that isn't there anymore. Thorne leaned against the doorway, watching the boy sit quiet at the table. You think he remembers? I think he remembers everything. He just won't let it out. I've seen that before. In men. Pearl didn't ask for details. Instead, she set the tin on the table and nodded for Winnie to call Wesley over. Thorne stepped aside as the girl darted past. Later that day, when the sun was high and the wind still, Pearl wandered toward the creek. The air was warm, the kind of stillness that made birds quiet and horses drowsy. She knelt by the water, running her fingers over the smooth stones that lined the bank. Used to come here when I first bought the land, Thorne said behind her. She didn't turn. It's peaceful. It was the only place I could breathe for a while. After the war. After my brother passed. She looked up then. You never told me he died. He stayed behind in Missouri. Caught fever after a flood ruined the crops. I wasn't there. I'm sorry, she said. Thorne crouched beside her. We were never close. Different in every way except name. Still, I shouldn't have left him behind. You couldn't have known, she said. Guilt doesn't change the past. No, but it teaches you to pay attention to what's in front of you. Pearl looked down at the water again. I don't know if I'm doing right by them. You are. She shook her head. I've never raised children. I was a girl myself when I left home. My father said I'd come to nothing. Thorne's jaw tightened. He was wrong. I wanted to prove him wrong for a long time. Then I just wanted to survive. You've done more than survive. She skimmed a flat stone across the surface. Skipped twice, then sank. I still feel like I'm waiting for the ground to drop out. It won't. Not here. She turned her head. Why are you being kind to me, Thorne? He didn't look away. Because I remember who you were. Because I see who you are now. That's not reason enough. Then I'll give you another. I want you here. Pearl's breath caught. It wasn't the words plain and quiet as they were, it was the way he said them. Like he meant to keep her anchored. She stood slowly. I should get back. Winnie wanted to help with supper. He rose beside her. I'll walk you. They didn't speak on the way back, but she noticed how he stayed close enough that their arms brushed once when she stumbled over a root. He didn't take her hand. He didn't need to. That night, after the children were asleep, Pearl sat at the table with a tin cup of coffee cooling beside her. She turned over a needle and thread, patching the knees of Wesley's trousers. Thorne sat in the rocker, mending a split in the harness. You ever miss Missouri? She asked without looking up. No, he said. I miss people. Not the place. I miss the sound of crickets. The way the trees held the heat after dusk. He tilted his head. I remember you used to climb that old elm behind the mill. You'd sit up there for hours like you were waiting on something. I was waiting on everything, she said. A life that wasn't mine yet. Thorne set the harness aside. You think you found it? No, she said, and then quieter. But I think I might have found the place where it could begin. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. He only got up, crossed the space between them, and set the gloves she'd used that day gently back on the table beside her mending. I'll add a loop to hang them by the door, he said. She looked up at him. That'd be good. As he turned away, she touched the edge of his sleeve. Thank you. He paused, then rested his hand lightly over hers. You're not alone anymore, Pearl. She didn't speak. She just held still under his touch, letting the warmth of it settle into her skin like something quietly earned. Outside, the wind stirred the dry grass. Inside, the fire crackled low, and for the first time in a long while, she believed him. She wasn't alone. Not anymore. The first frost came early that year. It crept in one morning, silvering the edges of the window panes and stiffening the earth beneath Pearl's boots as she carried a bucket from the well. The air smelled of brittle leaves and wood smoke, and the trees along the creek had turned pale gold, the branches thinning with each wind that passed through. Pearl moved slower now, not from weariness but from caution. There was a stillness to this part of the season, a hush before the cold set in for good. She had come to know the rhythm of the land, how the light changed along the ridgeline, how the horses shifted when the wind turned, how the creek grew quieter as it narrowed under frost. Inside, Winnie sat at the table, threading dried apple slices onto string. Pearl had shown her how to hang them by the stove to keep through winter. She worked with her lips pressed tight, focused and careful. Wesley was on the floor, pushing a carved wooden horse back and forth in slow arcs. He had started making small sounds again, half words, mostly, but he hadn't spoken in full since their arrival. Pearl set the bucket down by the door. Thorne said the last of the calves are ready for weaning. He'll want help in the pens tomorrow. Winnie didn't look up. Will he need you? He'll need someone steady. I said I would. The girl nodded and Pearl turned to stir the beans warming on the stove. She had begun to notice how Winnie watched Thorne when he spoke, how she leaned toward him as if his voice steadied her. It wasn't something Pearl had taught her. It wasn't something she'd taught herself either. It just happened the way trust takes root when given space. That evening, Thorne returned with a cut on his forearm, a jagged line just above the wrist. He wrapped it in a rag before stepping through the door, but Pearl saw the blood anyway. Fence post split while I was driving the nail, he said, before she could ask. Caught me across the arm. She took the rag from him without a word, unwrapping it to reveal the raw edge of skin. He braced his hand on the table while she cleaned the wound with hot water and carbolic. You'll need stitches, she said. I've done worse with less. You won't do worse with me standing here. She threaded the needle, her fingers steady. He didn't flinch when the metal touched skin, but she saw the way his jaw tightened. She worked quickly, tying the thread close and neat, then covered the wound with a strip of linen. You'll need to keep it dry. I'll manage. Pearl looked up at him. You should have called for me sooner. He met her eyes. I knew you'd come if I did. She stood there a moment, needle still in hand, the fire crackling behind her. She hadn't realized how close they'd become until that moment, not in words, but in the quiet way he trusted her hands, the way his presence filled the room without needing to explain itself. That night, after the children were asleep, Pearl sat at the table, winding twine for binding herbs. Thorne was by the hearth, reading from a ledger by lamplight. The silence between them was easy now, like an old blanket pulled over tired limbs. Did you ever think of marrying? Pearl asked, not looking up. Thorne didn't answer right away. He closed the ledger slowly, set it aside. Once, he said. Years ago in Laramie. She was a widow with a boy. I helped them through a hard winter. Thought it might grow into something. What happened? She left in the spring. Said she needed to be near family. I didn't ask her to stay. Pearl nodded. You ever regret it? Sometimes. But I wasn't ready then. I didn't know how to offer anything real. She tied off the twine, smoothed it flat. And now? Thorne looked at her, his expression quiet. Now I don't waste time with what I can't keep. She met his gaze. You think I'll leave? I think you've had to leave too many places already. Pearl folded the cloth in her lap. I don't want to anymore. He didn't move from the hearth, but his eyes didn't leave hers. Then don't. The fire popped, wood settling into coals. Pearl reached for the kettle and poured water into a tin cup, her hands a little unsteady now. In the days that followed, the cold deepened. Frost clung to the fence rails each morning, and the creek slowed to a thin trickle beneath a film of ice. Thorne gave her space to work, but they fell into a rhythm, shared tasks, short words, long silences that said more than speech ever could. One afternoon, as she gathered dried lavender from the rafters, Pearl heard a knock on the door, 2 light taps, then one firm. She opened it to find a man on horseback, wrapped in a wool coat, hat pulled low. His eyes narrowed when he saw her. You're Pearl Ashford, he said. I am. He dismounted, tying his reins loosely to the hitching post. Name's Claude Mercer. I was sent from Cheyenne. Pearl's throat tightened. Why? She was my sister, he said. The children's mother. Pearl stepped outside, pulling the door closed behind her. She never spoke of a brother. We were estranged. I didn't know she'd passed until a month ago. Took me time to track you. Pearl folded her arms. What do you want? He glanced toward the window. I came to see the children. Maybe take them back. No, Claude's face shifted. You've no claim to them. I made a promise. I've kept them fed, warm, safe, all things you didn't. He straightened. You've got no blood tie. A judge won't. I don't care what a judge might say. They're not cattle to be passed from hand to hand. The door opened behind them. Thorne stepped out, hands empty, stance calm. There a reason you're raising your voice on my land? Claude looked him over. You the rancher? I am. I want to talk to you about those children. You'll talk to her, and you'll do it civilly. Pearl's heart pounded, but she kept her voice even. You want to see them? Fine. But you're not taking them. Claude hesitated, then nodded once. Tomorrow. I'll come back. When he rode away, Thorne looked at her. You want me here when he returns? I don't need you to speak for me. I know. But I'll be here. That night, she didn't sleep. She lay on the cot beside Winnie and watched the shadows shift across the ceiling. She thought of the promise she made, of the way Wesley had finally taken her hand last week while crossing the creek. She thought of how easily the world took things from women without asking. In the morning, Claude returned. The children sat at the table watching him with wary eyes. He spoke to them softly, but they didn't rise. Wesley leaned against Pearl's side, his fingers tight in her apron. Claude stood after a few minutes. They don't remember me. Pearl didn't answer. I'm not a cruel man, he said. But I can't take what doesn't want to be taken. She nodded. Then go. He left with no threat, no final word. Just a nod, and the sound of hooves fading into the field. Later, as the sun dipped low, Thorne found her by the woodpile, arms full. He reached out and took half the stack without asking. You did right by them, he said. Pearl looked over. I wasn't sure I could. You did. She stared at him, then down at the ring. He held out a plain silver band in his callous palm. I had this made in town. Figured I'd wait until you knew you were staying. Pearl stared at the ring, her breath catching. You don't have to say anything now, he said. But I want you here. With me. With them. Her voice shook. You're sure? He nodded. I've never been more. She took the ring from his hand, pressed it into her palm. Then I say yes. He stepped closer, wrapped his arms around her, and she leaned into him, closing her eyes. There were no more words. Just the sound of the wind through the grass and the steady beat of his heart against hers. Pearl had wandered far. But this was home. The snow came 2 weeks earlier than expected, blanketing the Sutton land in a hush that softened every sound. It was a dry snow, thin and powder-fine, and it clung to the fence rails and hay roof with a kind of delicate insistence. Inside the cabin, the warmth from the stove touched every corner. The scent of beeswax and dried sage clung to the air, and Pearl's hands stayed warm from work rather than fire. She had taken to rising before the light touched the horizon, not out of necessity but from habit. The quiet hour before the children stirred was hers alone, and she used it to knead bread, mend seams, and feel the weight of stillness settle into her bones in a way that felt less like burden and more like belonging. The morning after Claude Mercer had ridden out for the last time, Thorne brought in a cedar box wrapped in oilskin, the seams worn smooth from use. He set it on the table, dusted snow from his shoulders, and waited while she studied it. I've had it since I was 21, he said, unclasping the lid. Built it myself. Took the carpenter in town 3 months to teach me steadiness enough. Pearl stepped closer. Inside were tools, thin-handled knives, a whetstone, sandpaper worn soft at the corners, and one small carving of a cow elk, the grain of the wood rising like muscle beneath her coat. I don't carve anymore, he said. But it helped me once when I had too much in me to carry. Pearl touched the elk's back. The curve was smooth, the lines sure and deliberate. I want Wesley to have it, Thorne added. When he's ready. Pearl looked over at him, but he wasn't watching her. His gaze stayed on the box, his hands steady at his sides. I think he will be, she said. Thorne nodded once. He watches everything. That's how you know. By the next day, the snow had deepened. Thorne hitchhiked the sleigh and took Winnie along to the outlying shed to check on the stored feed. Pearl stayed back with Wesley, who had taken to curling up beneath the table while she worked, resting his head on her foot like it anchored him. She was sewing patches to a wool coat when she felt a tug at her skirt. Wesley stood beside her, chin tilted up. She set the needle down. You all right? He nodded, then stepped closer and slid his arms around her waist in a quiet, sudden hug. He didn't say anything, but Pearl's throat tightened with the force of it. She dropped her hand to his hair, running her fingers gently over the crown of his head. He stayed like that for a long while. That evening, Thorne returned with Winnie half asleep against his side. He carried her in, boots dusted with snow, face ruddy with cold. Pearl helped pull the blankets back so he could lay the girl down, and when he turned, his eyes softened at the sight of Wesley nestled against Pearl's shoulder. "She spoke the whole way there," Thorne said quietly. "Told me about her ma's blue dress. Said you showed her how to braid like she used to." Pearl nodded, brushing a curl from Winnie's cheek. "She remembered more than I thought. Children carry more than they say." Later, after the cabin had gone quiet, Thorne poured 2 cups of chicory and sat across from her at the table. They didn't call it courting, but something in the way he leaned forward, elbows lightly on the wood, the way his eyes stayed steady on her face, made it feel like the kind of intimacy that didn't need naming. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the spring." Pearl waited. "There's land over the ridge. Was my brother's, but it's been untouched since he passed. I keep thinking about what it could be." She traced the rim of her cup. "What do you want it to be?" He took a breath. "A place for more. A garden, a second barn. Maybe a smokehouse. Room enough to build something with breadth to it." Pearl didn't answer right away. She turned the thought over in her mind, quiet as a prayer. "You want me to help you build it?" she asked. "I want you to help me build us," he said, his voice low. "That's what I meant." Pearl looked down at her hands. The knuckles were red from cold, the nails worn short, but they were the hands of a woman who had stayed, who had chosen not to run even when the road had opened wide behind her. "I'm not afraid of work," she said softly. "I know you're not. I'm afraid of losing what I find." Thorne leaned back, his gaze steady. "I don't plan to be lost. Not from you." She looked at him, long and quiet. "I'll help you build it. All of it." He nodded, then reached across the table and took her hand. There was no need for more. The next week, the snow deepened and the world shrank to the cabin and the land it touched. Pearl taught Winnie to spin thread from wool, and Thorne showed Wesley how to measure boards with a square. They didn't ask more of him than he could give. Every day he gave a little more. One evening, Thorne came in with a letter bearing the Cheyenne postmark. Pearl opened it with careful fingers, unfolding the paper to find a note from a woman she had worked with at the boarding house, a short message, no more than a dozen lines. A girl named Helen was ill. No family left. She had asked for Pearl by name. "I should go," Pearl said, folding the letter. "If she's asking, I can't leave her alone in that." Thorne didn't argue. "Already the sleigh in the morning." She looked up. "I thought you'd try to talk me out of it. I would not have known you if you could turn from that." Pearl packed only what she needed: wool skirts, a shawl lined with rabbit fur, and the gloves Thorne had found for her months before. He tucked extra blankets into the sleigh and wrapped her food in oilskin. As the dawn settled cold and bright over the land, he lifted her into the seat and placed the reins in her hands. "I'll be back by week's end," she said, though she couldn't be sure. Thorne brushed her cheek with the back of his hand. "I'll wait." The drive was slow, the trail half hidden by snow and the wind sharp against her face. By the time she reached Cheyenne, the sun had dipped low and the town lights flickered like beacons through the dusk. Helen was thinner than Pearl remembered, her cheeks hollowed and her voice faint. Pearl sat by the bed for 3 days, feeding her broth, cooling her brow, listening to her memories unravel in pieces. On the 4th morning, Helen passed with Pearl's hand in hers. Pearl helped the undertaker arrange burial, signed her name in the ledger, and stood alone beneath the bare branches of a cottonwood as they lowered the body into the frozen earth. She didn't cry. She'd done that already. When she returned, the snow had stilled. The sky above the Sutton ranch was pale and clear, and the smoke from the chimney curled upward like a prayer sent home. Thorne met her at the gate, his coat heavy with frost. "You're back," he said quietly. "I kept my word." He reached for her hand, cold from the rains. "I never doubted it." Inside, Winnie ran to her with a drawing, a crooked square with stick figures standing around it. Pearl bent down to take it, her eyes catching on the words written in Thorne's hand at the bottom. "Home." She looked up at him, her heart full. "You wrote that?" His voice was soft. "She told me what to say." Pearl folded the paper and held it to her chest. She was right. That night, as they stood on the porch beneath a sky so full of stars it looked like it might split open, Thorne reached for something hidden in his coat. Not a ring this time, he'd already given her that, but a folded paper, creased at the corners. It was a deed, her name written beside his. Pearl ran her fingers over the ink, the letters steady and sure. I wanted it to be ours, he said. She pressed the paper to her lips. It is. And when he pulled her close, she let herself lean into it not as a woman seeking shelter, but as one who had found her place, her people, and a love steady as the land beneath her feet. The thaw came slow that year. Snow held to the hollows long after the sun returned, and the creek ran high with meltwater, fast and cold against the banks. Mud clung to boots and wagon wheels alike, and the early shoots of green pushed stubbornly through the frostbitten ground. Spring, it seemed, had to fight its way in. Pearl stood with her hands buried in the soil of the far field, sleeves rolled high, skirt pinned back to keep from dragging. The wind teased at the loose curls near her neck. She leaned over the first row of seedlings pole beans this time and pressed each one into the earth with a steady rhythm. She didn't hum, not out loud, but there was something like music in the way her movements followed the breath of the land. Thorne watched from the fence line, arms crossed over the top rail. He no longer tried to take work from her hands. He'd come to understand she needed it the same way he needed the quiet hours in the barn where wood and leather answered back more honestly than most men ever had. You're planting them too close, he said. Pearl didn't look up. I'm planting them close enough to keep each other from drying out. He raised a brow. That what they taught you in boarding houses? She pressed the last seed down and brushed her hands off. That's what I learned watching them grow wild behind the bakery in Cheyenne. They climb better when they've got something near. Thorne stepped down from the fence, boots sinking into the softened ground. You think we're like that? Pearl looked at him, the corner of her mouth lifting. I think we climb better together than we ever did alone. He took her hand then, mud and all, and kissed her knuckles. That's the first time you've said something like that plain. You've earned it. He held her hand longer than he needed to, then let go and turned toward the barn. Wesley's been asking to help with the bridles. I told him he could start with polishing. He'll be careful, Pearl said. I know. I just don't want him to think he has to be perfect. He won't. Not with you showing him. That evening they sat on the porch with their boots off, feet stretched toward the last warmth of the day. Winnie braided dried grass into little circles and laid them in a row, saying they were crowns for the chickens. Wesley leaned against Thorne's side, watching the dog sleep. Pearl rested her head on Thorne's shoulder, and he reached for her hand without looking. They stayed that way until the light dipped low and the first night birds began calling from the trees. I sent a letter to the circuit judge, Thorne said softly. Pearl turned toward him, brows drawn. What for? About the children. I asked what it'd take to make you their guardian legal and proper. She sat up straighter. You didn't ask me first. I didn't think I needed to. You already are. Pearl looked out toward the field. The rows they'd turned together were dark with moisture, the soil rich and ready. And what did he say? Said he'd come through in June. He wants to meet you, ask you a few things. But it's just formality, really. Pearl was quiet a long moment. I've never had a name that meant anything to anyone. You've got one now, Thorne said. And you've got theirs too, if you want it. She turned her face back to him. The porch light caught the faint scar on his cheek, the one from years ago he never quite spoke of. She reached up and brushed her fingers over it. I do want it, she said. All of it. You, them, the name, the land. I want the whole of it. He kissed her, then not rushed, not unsure, but with the slow certainty of a man who'd waited long enough to know what mattered. The next weeks passed in steady rhythm. Pearl met with the judge in town, answered his questions, watched him nod slowly as he took notes with his left hand, the right stiff from an old wound. Thorne waited outside the courthouse, leaning against the wagon, hat low over his eyes. When she stepped out, she didn't need to say anything. He saw the answer in her face and lifted her hand to kiss the back of it. Afterward, they stopped by the carpenter's house. Thorne spoke quietly while Pearl waited with the children, pretending not to hear the discussion about wood types and rope-back chairs. Winnie whispered to Wesley that they were getting a porch swing, and Pearl said nothing to correct her. By May, the garden had taken hold. Beans climbed the poles, squash curled broad leaves over the soil, and the tomatoes began to flower. Pearl taught Winnie how to pinch the blossoms so they'd fruit heavier. Wesley followed her from row to row, placing flat stones to mark where they'd watered last. One morning, as they packed a basket for the first picnic of the season, Thorne came in from the barn with something hidden behind his back. Pearl arched a brow. That better not be another carving. It's not. He stepped forward and produced a small, flat box. He opened it with one hand to reveal a gold ring, plain but finely made, the band smooth and narrow, the stone a dark green flecked with copper, nothing flashy but unmistakably chosen. Pearl stared at it. I already said yes. Thorne smiled, slow and sure. You said yes to the life. I want you to say yes to the name too. She took the ring, slid it onto her hand and held it up in the light. Then yes. They married in June under the cottonwoods by the creek. No music, no preacher in robes, just the judge from town, a worn Bible, and the wind moving through the leaves. Winnie carried a bunch of wildflowers, and Wesley stood beside Thorne, holding a handkerchief he didn't quite know what to do with. Pearl wore a new dress, sky blue with white stitching, and her hair in a braid wrapped round like a crown. Thorne had shaved, and his shirt was pressed flat. When he said her name at the end, Pearl Sutton, it landed soft and full in the space between them, like it had always been meant to be spoken that way. They ate on blankets near the creek, passing bread and cheese and berries between them. The sun stayed high, and the children ran until their cheeks were flushed and their feet were caked with mud. That night, after the children were asleep, Pearl stood by the window brushing her hair. Thorne came behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and pressed his face into her neck. You tired? He asked. Not of this. He kissed the hollow behind her ear, slow and certain. We built it, Pearl. Just like we said. She turned in his arms. And we'll keep building. They didn't talk after that. They didn't need to. Years passed as years do. The land held firm beneath them. The porch swing creaked in rhythm with summer afternoons. Their garden grew wide, then wider. A milk cow calved. The barn got a new roof. And one day Wesley spoke his first full sentence while helping Thorne mend a saddle. He said, I'll do it, and Thorne didn't answer right away, just handed him the awl and nodded. Winnie grew tall and bright-eyed and clever with her hands. She could sew a hem as clean as Pearl, and by 15 she'd taken to walking the fence line alone and talking about a boy in town who brought her books instead of flowers. Pearl never stopped rising early. She still baked bread, still turned the soil by hand, still paused to watch the sun come up over the ridge. She wore her ring every day, never took it off, not even to knead dough or scrub the floor. Thorne built her a greenhouse on the far edge of the yard, a frame of glass and old barn wood, where she grew mint and lavender through the winter. He still carved, though only when the house was quiet. His hands had grown slower, but not less steady. On their 10th anniversary, they stood by the creek again, just the two of them. Pearl picked a sprig of yarrow from the bank and tucked it behind Thorne's ear. You've still got dirt under your nails, he said. She smiled. It doesn't wash off anymore. Good, he said. It looks right on you. She took his hand. They stood like that a long while, listening to the water move over stone. And when they returned to the house, the porch light glowing warm against the dusk, they stepped inside a home not borrowed, not built from duty or desperation, but from choice, from trust, from the quiet, grounded love of two people who'd learned to grow side by side. Together, they had made something that would last.